In the heart of Modesto, on an ordinary day, a seemingly unremarkable woman with a weathered face and a simple, worn sack walked into the prestigious Hamilton First Bank. At first glance, no one paid her any attention. She was dressed in a faded blue dress, orthopedic shoes, and a wide-brimmed straw hat, looking like she belonged to another time, a throwback to an era that no one expected to see. The doors of the bank swung open as she entered, her every step deliberate and measured, her presence as calm as if she had done this 100 times before. She wasn't there to make a deposit or withdraw money. No. With an air of quiet confidence, she made her way to the center of the lobby and, without hesitation, asked the young teller for access to her office. The teller, engrossed in his work, barely looked up. His voice was dismissive as he assumed she was just another customer. "Ma'am, if you're here to make a deposit, you'll need to take a number," he said without even a glance in her direction. But the woman, unbothered, simply responded, "I'm not here to make a deposit." That's when the atmosphere shifted, subtle at first, but undeniable. The teller raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "Your office?" he asked, confusion creeping into his tone. The woman nodded once, slowly. "Top floor, behind the frosted glass. It used to be my grandfather's. I'm here to reclaim it." The room fell silent. Laughter rippled from the back of the bank, as staff exchanged skeptical looks. Who was this woman, and why was she claiming to own a bank? What followed was a revelation that would shake everything the bank stood for. Stay tuned to see what happens next. The moment Odessa spoke, the room seemed to freeze. The staff behind the counters, once laughing, now stood still, unsure of how to respond. Odessa's voice was calm, almost serene, as she stated simply, "I'm not here to make a deposit." The words hung in the air, drawing a moment of silence. The young teller, now looking up in disbelief, stared at her, his eyes scanning her worn clothes, the faded blue dress, and the old, stitched initials on the sack hanging from her shoulder. Was this a joke? A mistake? But Odessa wasn't joking. Her gaze never wavered, her expression unwavering, as she repeated, "I'm here to reclaim what's mine." There was something in the way she said it, something that made the air in the bank feel thicker, more charged. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was charged, heavy with something no one in the room could quite place. The assistant manager, who had been standing near the back, suddenly stepped forward, his curiosity piqued by the woman's certainty. "Your office?" he asked, clearly confused. "What do you mean by your office?" Odessa didn't flinch. She simply nodded once, her calm gaze unwavering. "Top floor, behind the frosted glass. It used to be my grandfather's office. I'm here to reclaim it," she explained, her voice still steady but now tinged with something else, something that felt like history. And then the laughter started, quiet at first, from a young woman at the counter who couldn't contain her amusement. It spread like wildfire across the room. A low chuckle, followed by a cough, an attempt to cover it up. The bank security guard raised an eyebrow, clearly confused, and leaned forward from his stool. "You own this bank?" The teller's voice was a mix of amusement and disbelief. "Ma'am, this is Hamilton First Corporate Bank, not a diner. Are you sure you're in the right building?" Odessa didn't blink. She lowered the sack from her shoulder and set it gently on the tile floor, the zipper stiff with age, but it opened without a sound. The room watched in silence as she reached in and began to pull out a series of carefully folded documents. A birth certificate, brittle and yellowed with age. A stack of parchment-colored papers that looked like they had been untouched for decades. And then, a glossy black and white photo, an image frozen in time, showing her grandfather, Elijah Jenkins, shaking hands with Ernest Hamilton in front of a building that looked eerily familiar. It was the same building they were standing in, but decades ago, in a different era, in a world that had long since erased its history. Odessa didn't say a word as she placed the documents on the counter, one by one. The staff watched, mesmerized, as she pulled out a final laminated page. An old signature, faint and fading but still legible. H. Hamilton. The room went completely still. The laughter faded. The young teller leaned forward, scanning the paper, his face draining of color as the truth began to settle in. His eyes met the assistant manager's, and for the first time, they both understood. This wasn't a prank. Odessa Bell Jenkins wasn't here by accident. The assistant manager stepped closer, his voice suddenly quieter, more cautious. "Where did you get these?" he asked, his tone now tinged with apprehension. "My grandfather gave them to me," Odessa replied simply. "Before he died, he told me to protect them. He said the world would forget, but paper doesn't." She paused, letting the weight of her words hang in the air. "You might want to call your legal department." And just like that, the air shifted again. The laughter that once echoed through the lobby was replaced by hushed whispers. The world that had once overlooked Odessa Jenkins was starting to change. What followed was a confrontation no one in that bank would ever forget. A woman, carrying nothing but the weight of her grandfather's legacy, was about to make history, and the truth was more powerful than anyone could have ever imagined. As the documents lay on the counter before them, the room was filled with an eerie quiet, everyone frozen in a moment of realization. Odessa's calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the palpable tension in the air. The assistant manager, Joseph Lyles, stood frozen, staring at the papers in disbelief. His fingers hovered over the faded document with the signature he never expected to see: H. Hamilton, the founder of Hamilton First Bank. The words on the page began to blur together as his mind struggled to process the magnitude of what he was seeing. Odessa didn't rush. She didn't need to. She had all the time in the world. "Start with that one," she said quietly, pointing at a single document in the center. The words "transfer of controlling interest," printed in old typewriter font, were still clear enough to read. It was signed in 1957 by her grandfather, Elijah Jenkins. Lyles took the document carefully, as if it might fall apart in his hands. His eyes scanned the words, but it was as though his mind couldn't comprehend the weight of them. He looked up at Odessa, his voice trembling as he asked, "What is this?" "This is the real ownership," Odessa replied, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. "Before Hamilton First became part of Weston Consolidated, my grandfather was the largest stakeholder. But the name stayed. They erased him with paperwork." A stunned silence hung in the room. Lyles looked to his colleagues for confirmation, but no one spoke. He flipped through the document again, as if hoping the truth would somehow change. The assistant manager didn't seem to want to believe what he was seeing, but deep down, he knew this was no mistake. "You're saying your grandfather owned this bank?" Lyles asked, disbelief still lacing his voice. "Why would he hide that?" Odessa's expression remained calm, but there was a fire behind her eyes. A fire fueled by years of watching her family's history being erased. "He didn't hide it," she replied. "He was forced out, bought out with bad faith terms, promised shares that were never registered. The merger in 1974? That was just a fancy word for theft." She let the words hang in the air, the accusation settling over the room like a storm cloud. Odessa had carried this truth for decades, holding on to the pieces of a broken legacy. And now, for the first time, it was out in the open and no one could ignore it. The assistant manager opened his mouth to object, but his words were cut off when he saw Odessa take out another document, this one yellowed with age and clearly important. She slid it toward him, her fingers barely brushing the edges of the paper. It was a notarized affidavit signed by Ernest Hamilton himself, acknowledging Elijah Jenkins as a co-founder and majority shareholder of the bank. Lyles glanced at it, his face pale. This can't be real," he muttered, running a hand through his thinning hair. But Odessa didn't flinch. She simply waited, her calm presence unwavering in the face of their disbelief. She knew they were struggling to come to terms with what they were seeing. But this was her grandfather's legacy. These were the documents he'd trusted her to protect, and they were real. "The Jenkins name has never come up in our archives," Lyles said, his voice quieter now, less confident. "Not everything makes it into the archives," Odessa replied, her tone matter of fact. "When people want it buried, it stays buried. But that doesn't make it disappear." There was a shift in the room. an invisible pressure that seemed to mount as more of the truth came to light. Odessa wasn't there to beg. She wasn't there to prove anything. She was there because the world had forgotten her grandfather's role in building this place, and she was determined to make sure they remembered. Her eyes met Lyle's with quiet determination. "You should call your legal department," she said, her voice unwavering, "because this is just the beginning." And in that moment, Odessa Bell Jenkins wasn't just reclaiming an office. She was reclaiming history, her family's history, and no one in that room could deny it. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. As the room processed the weight of the documents on the table, Odessa remained an unshakable pillar of calm. She could feel their disbelief, but she was no longer bothered. She had waited decades for this moment, one where history would finally be set right. She didn't need to say much more. She had the proof, and that spoke louder than any words ever could. She slowly reached into her sack again, drawing out yet another crucial piece of the puzzle. This time, it was a delicate letter, its edges worn with age but the ink still legible. Carefully, Odessa unfolded it and laid it on the table before the group. The document was a letter from her grandfather, Elijah Jenkins, written in 1961, an unmistakable declaration of foresight. The letter spoke of the quiet betrayal her family had suffered, of the promises made and broken. "They will come for what is ours," her grandfather had written, his words prophetic. "But paper will survive where memory fails." Odessa didn't need to explain the significance. They could all read it for themselves. The room went silent again, the air thick with the realization that the man who founded this bank had known it was all slipping away and had documented everything. The smart move, keeping records, filing claims, protecting the truth, was a move most overlooked in favor of convenience and profit. But Odessa had outlasted them all, patiently collecting pieces of her grandfather's legacy for years, quietly making her claims year after year. She had prepared for this moment. Every document, every letter, every piece of evidence was a stroke in the masterpiece of justice she was now laying before them. "I've been filing claims with the county for decades," she said softly. "The truth is a patient thing, but it always wins in the end." The tension in the room was palpable, but Odessa's composure never faltered. She was no longer speaking just to convince the staff or the managers. She was presenting undeniable truths, each document a piece of the story she had carried for years. And now, as the assistant manager, Lyles stood with the last of the papers in his hand, his eyes wide. Odessa's quiet confidence became the calm before the storm. "You understand what you're looking at, don't you?" Odessa asked, her voice steady but carrying an edge of clarity that resonated with authority. "You're looking at history, my family's history, erased by people who thought they could control the narrative." Lyles looked down at the stack of documents, his hands trembling slightly as he scanned through pages filled with legal jargon, signatures, and notes from decades ago. These weren't just papers. They were pieces of a puzzle, and as the pieces came together, the truth became impossible to ignore. Odessa had already told them everything they needed to know. The documents were more than just evidence. They were the testimony of a betrayal that had occurred long before anyone in the room was even born. "Where did you find all of this?" Lyles asked, his voice no longer dismissive but full of genuine curiosity and something else. Something like respect. Odessa paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the room as she carefully chose her words. "I didn't find these in a filing cabinet or an archive. I found them in places where no one bothered to look. In the basement of a church, in my uncle's attic, in county offices that didn't know what they had." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking with his. "I've been gathering these pieces for decades. Every year, I filed claims with the county. Every decade, I fought for what was rightfully mine." Lyles blinked, his disbelief still hanging in the air. But he couldn't argue with the paper trail. Each document was meticulous, detailed, and undeniable. Odessa's intelligence was apparent not just in the facts she presented, but in the way she had anticipated every challenge, every doubt, and had an answer prepared. She wasn't simply presenting evidence. She was dismantling their assumptions, piece by piece, until they had no choice but to confront the truth. The room was now full of questions. questions that had no simple answers. How could something like this have been hidden for so long? How had the records been so carefully manipulated? Odessa didn't need to answer. The documents spoke for themselves. "Paper doesn't lie," she said, her voice soft but filled with wisdom. "People do." She sat back in her chair, watching the legal team flip through the papers in silence. The realization was sinking in. The history they had been taught, the history they thought they knew, was wrong. And Odessa wasn't just reclaiming her grandfather's legacy. She was rewriting the story of the bank, one page at a time. "Do you want to continue denying it?" she asked, her eyes now fixed on Lyles, who, for the first time, didn't have an answer. She had laid out the truth, clear and irrefutable. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. This was no longer a claim. It was a demand for justice, and the world was about to see it unfold. The air in the room thickened as the truth settled, like a heavy blanket that no one could escape from. Odessa sat there, unmoving, watching the lawyers flip through the evidence she had so carefully laid out, each page a reminder of the betrayal, the lies, and the history that had been erased. Her calm presence contrasted with the rising tension in the room, where everyone could feel it. The walls were closing in. The assistant manager, Lyles, continued to pace, muttering under his breath. His face, once confident and dismissive, was now pale with the realization that everything he thought he knew was wrong. This can't be real," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice anymore. His words felt hollow. "There must be some mistake," he added, trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. Odessa didn't respond. She simply watched, her eyes sharp and clear, never leaving his face. She knew he was struggling to reconcile the history he'd been taught with the evidence in front of him, the legacy that had been so carefully hidden, so perfectly manipulated. She'd been waiting for this moment her whole life, and now it was unfolding in front of her, and nothing was going to take it away. But just when it seemed like they might finally grasp the magnitude of the situation, the tension broke in an unexpected way. The door opened suddenly, and the regional legal team from headquarters arrived. A group of sharp-suited professionals, led by a woman with a face as cold as steel. They entered the room like a force of nature, and the temperature seemed to drop instantly. Odessa barely reacted as the lead attorney, Bryce Hanley, set his briefcase on the table, his eyes scanning the room like a predator. "We understand you're claiming ownership rights of this bank?" Hanley asked, his tone a mixture of amusement and skepticism. Odessa didn't blink. She simply met his gaze with the full weight of her conviction. "I'm not claiming anything," she replied evenly. "I'm here to reclaim what was taken from my family, what was stolen." For a moment, Hanley just stared at her, taken aback. His lips pressed together as if he'd been expecting a fight, but this was different. There was no anger, no desperation in Odessa's voice. There was only quiet resolve. He glanced at the papers, flipping through them quickly, his eyes narrowing with each page. And then the silence took over again. The tension was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Odessa's eyes remained fixed on Hanley, and for the first time he seemed unsure. The slick confidence he'd walked in with was slipping away. For a brief second, Odessa allowed herself a moment of peace. She had fought for this. She had lived with the injustice for so long, had carried the weight of her family's erased legacy in her heart for years. The pain of watching her grandfather's name disappear from history had been unbearable. But now, here, with the truth laid bare, it was finally being seen. And no matter what happened next, it didn't matter. This was her moment, and as Hanley fumbled with the papers, a question lingered in the air, one that Odessa had already answered in her heart. Would they finally hear her? But before anyone could say another word, a quiet voice cut through the silence. "Wait," the assistant manager, Lyles, whispered, his voice shaky as he turned to the others. This is Ernest Hamilton's handwriting. This is his signature." Odessa looked at him, and for the first time since she walked into the bank, the slightest trace of a smile played at the corners of her lips. The truth had been waiting to be heard for far too long. Now it could no longer be ignored. The room was electric, crackling with tension, as Odessa's calmness met the bank's rising panic head-on. The moment Lyles acknowledged the unmistakable handwriting of Ernest Hamilton, the atmosphere shifted, like a dam had just cracked open. The lead attorney, Bryce Hanley, who had initially walked in with an air of superiority, now stood frozen, his mind scrambling to catch up with what was unfolding before him. His polished exterior faltered as the reality of Odessa's claim began to sink in. The silence stretched long, filled only by the soft rustle of papers. Hanley finally broke it, his voice low and controlled, though tinged with urgency. This isn't something we can ignore. We'll need to verify everything. But it's clear this isn't just a misunderstanding. Odessa didn't flinch. She didn't need to. She had been patient for decades, waiting for this very moment. "You should have done this years ago," she said, her voice quiet but piercing. There was no anger in her words, only the sharp clarity of someone who had lived with the weight of her grandfather's erased legacy for far too long. "But now you don't have a choice." Hanley exchanged a glance with the other lawyers, their faces drawn tight with the realization that they were standing on the edge of something much bigger than they'd expected. One of them pulled out a phone, quickly typing in the details to contact corporate headquarters. The sound of his tapping fingers was the only noise that dared break the tense silence. Odessa, however, sat back in her chair, every muscle relaxed. She wasn't here to fight. She was here to win. She had the truth. And the truth, no matter how long it had been buried, had a way of rising to the surface. "They'll be sending a team from corporate," Hanley muttered, almost to himself. "They'll want to see everything, get it all organized." Odessa nodded. "I've already organized it." Her eyes never left his. "But the real question is, what are you going to do about it?" The truth had come to light. The bank's response was no longer a matter of if, but how quickly they would be forced to face the reckoning that had been decades in the making. As the regional legal team gathered the evidence, the atmosphere in the room shifted yet again. The tension, once suffocating, was now tempered with a sense of inevitability. Odessa sat at the center of it all, her calm unwavering, her posture still a symbol of quiet strength. The truth was now undeniable, and with it came a power that no one could ignore. Odessa had waited for this moment for decades. She had lived with the sting of injustice, watched as her grandfather's legacy was erased from history, and quietly fought to reclaim it year after year. And now, the truth was not only being acknowledged, it was being embraced. The legal team had no choice but to accept what was laid before them. But Odessa wasn't looking for victory in the traditional sense. She wasn't here to tear the bank down, to seek revenge, or to destroy the men and women in the room. She was here to make it right, to restore what had been stolen from her family. And, in doing so, to remind everyone that the truth always has a way of coming to light. As the legal team prepared to leave, with the weight of their next steps hanging heavily in the air, Odessa stood up, her voice calm but firm. "I didn't come here to tear this place down," she said, her words resonating through the room. "I came here to make it honest, to put my family's name back where it belongs, on the records, on the walls, on the founding documents." And just like that, the legacy she had been fighting for, her grandfather's name, her family's history, was finally starting to be restored. It was a powerful moment, a testament to the resilience of one woman and the power of truth, personal opinion, and call to action. Odessa's story is not just about reclaiming ownership of a bank. It's about reclaiming what's rightfully yours, whether it's a legacy, a story, or a truth that's been forgotten. The courage to stand up for what's right, no matter the odds, is something that we can all take away from her journey. Her quiet strength, her unwavering belief in the truth, and her patience over decades serve as a powerful reminder that sometimes the fight for justice is long, but it is always worth it. If you've been inspired by Odessa's courage and perseverance, I encourage you to subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories that highlight the power of truth, justice, and resilience. By subscribing, you'll be joining a community that values strength, intelligence, and the drive to make a positive impact in the world. Don't miss out on the next great story. Hit that subscribe button now and be part of the journey.